Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Menil Collection. My name is Mary Magsamen, and I am the manager of the public programs here, and very happy to have you all here with us tonight for the panel discussion titled Connecting Lines, Janet Sobel and Abstract Expressionism. Our next program is on May 2nd at noon. This is an online artist talk with Michelle Stewart. It will be recorded, as are many of our public programs, so you can check out our YouTube page or you can join us online on the 2nd at noon as well. I'd like to remind you to please be courteous and turn off or silence your cell phones. Our panel tonight includes Susan Davidson, Natalie Dupêcher, and Sandra Zalman. Natalie Dupêcher is the Associate Curator of Modern Art at the Menil and is the curator of the Janet Sobel All Over exhibition. She is an expert on Surrealism, the avant-garde, and histories of abstraction. Susan Davidson is a curator and art historian. She is an authority in Surrealism, abstract expressionism, and pop art, and she has expertise in the work of Robert Rauschenberg. She's held curatorial positions here at the Menil Collection and at the Guggenheim Museum, and she served as a curatorial advisor and a board member for the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. Sandra Zalman is an associate professor of art history at the University of Houston. She teaches classes on modern and contemporary art, museums, and curatorial issues. Her first book is titled Consuming Surrealism in American Culture, Dissident Modernism, and she also authored the paper Janet Sobel, Primitive, Modern, and the Origins of Abstract Expressionism. Please join me in welcoming our panelists in a discussion on abstract expressionism and the wonderful work of Janet Sobel. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out and joining us tonight. I'm so thrilled to be joined by Sandra and Susan to have this conversation about Sobel's work. I hope most of you had the opportunity to sneak down the hall and see the exhibition before we started. It will be on view until August 11th, so you still have a lot of time. And just by way of introduction, this is a photograph of the artist whose work we will be looking at tonight. Janet Sobel was we'll get into her sort of artistic identity, but was a major modern artist who had a short-lived but meteoric career in New York in the early to mid-1940s. And here we see her in her apartment studio in Brooklyn at work on a painting we'll look at later called The Burning Bush, surrounded by many other canvases of hers. This show focuses on her mostly abstract painting, although we also look a bit at how she got there. So one of the earliest objects in the show is this small drawing that she executed on a page from a MoMA catalog published in 1941 on the artist Salvador Dali. Another early work in the exhibition is this painting, Disappointment, that shows her in a more figurative stage, a kind of earlier moment of her career. But then already by 1945, only 2 years later, she had arrived at this spectacular, all-over, fully abstract composition titled Milky Way that's on loan to us from the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And you know, this is a solo show. We are looking very closely at Janet Sobel's art, and I think what we wanted this conversation to do is situate her more in context, in the context of New York in the 1940s and the various groups and other artists that she was associated with and exhibited with in those years. And the first person that we're going to talk about with regard to that is the woman who became her major champion from around fall 1944 on, and that was Peggy Guggenheim. So we're looking here at a couple images of Guggenheim. And Susan, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about her.
Well, that would require quite a long evening, but I have prepared just a few comments about her history and how she came to be the infamous collector that she is today. She was born in 1898 into a large Jewish family whose forebears had immigrated from Switzerland to America 50 years later. And initially established through a successful textile business in Philadelphia, her family's great wealth resulted from her grandfather's diversification into mining and smelting in the western United States and South America. Following her father's tragic death aboard the Titanic, with his mistress, I should add, Peggy inherited approximately $500,000, a handsome sum, although a pittance compared to what she might have enjoyed had her father not left the family business shortly before he died. So after coming into her fortune at age 21, she settled in Paris and married Lawrence Vail, an English bottle maker, collage bottle maker, who actually brought her into a very much of a bohemian circle. And when that marriage dissolved in 1932, she began to focus specifically on the art world and set up a gallery in London called Guggenheim Museum in January of 1938. And it was at that time that she decided that she wanted to build an art museum. She intended to do that in Europe, but the war did not allow that. And as we see here on the slides behind us or in front of me or whatever, she returns to America in July of 1941 with her then second husband, Max Ernst, who of course is well known to all of you here in Houston as one of the great champions of your Surrealist collection. They settled into a townhouse on Beekman Place, which is along the East River in around the 50s, and it became very much a center for everything that was going on in New York with all the emigre artists. And here we see a slide, next slide, of all of these various people, Duchamp and Mondrian in the back wall, Ernst Breton, and Léger, Bernice Abbott in the second row, and then in the first row, seated looking at each other, are Lenore Carrington and Frederick Kiesler. Kiesler would become a very important person for Peggy because he designs the Art of the Century Gallery, which is the museum that she has in New York, which opens in October of 1942. So it was a very intense, elaborate moment in New York. A lot of cross-fertilization. It was a very small world because people actually spent time with one another. It's not how we live today at all. But I think it was through this milieu of people that Sobel comes to Peggy's attention.
And I think just it's worth pausing to say and emphasize, as you just did, Susan, that there was the emigre artists that had come from Europe. There was this emerging group of young artists based in New York, and that there was this real kind of confusion, or like what would become a confusion of categories that Sandra has written about,
yes,
too.
Well, I would also add that Peggy was at Art of the Century. Not only did she show her collection, but she also gave a number of important American artists their first exhibitions. I'm talking about Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, William Baziotis, Clifford Still. And in some ways, that became the laboratory for how American abstract expressionism came forward out of this surrealist movement.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the layout of the gallery had one room was dedicated to abstraction, Peggy's abstraction collection, and one room to her surrealist collection. So she also kind of codified that tension between abstract and surrealism, even though those categories were extremely fluid. Mm-hmm. And artists were, of course, borrowing from both, surrealism also included abstraction and vice versa.
So Sobel has her first kind of major group exhibition in 1943. It is in Chicago. So even though we've talked about her being this rising kind of star in the New York scene, this major show of hers is actually in Chicago at the Arts Club, American Primitive Painting of 4 Centuries. And already here, this kind of sets her into a particular group, school, like aside other self-taught artists who were quite in vogue at that time. So here we see Spring Festival, which Sobel exhibited in Chicago with a Hirschfeld painting, Zebra Family, that was also shown there, which is pretty great.
I know, I'm just looking at the Zebra Family. I'm like, wow.
It's one of my favorite Hirschfelds. It's
one.
interesting because it's actually Sidney Janis who organizes this exhibition, and Sidney Janis started out in the shirt manufacturing business after being born. Actually, he began as a vaudeville dancer, which is something a lot of people don't know about him. But he then went into shirt manufacturing, and then he became a very concentrated collector. And he took that energy and his connections and really championed self-taught artists. He did the first self-taught art in America in 1942.
Yeah,
Yes.
and he was really obsessed with self-taught art. And that was part of this larger trend that I would argue, as the burgeoning American art world was kind of finding its contours and trying to see, what it was all about. There was this interest in originality, and I think self-taught artists were thought to be kind of unimpeachably original because they hadn't absorbed any ideas from their teachers. Though all of this was, of course, a construction, but it was a big fascination in the late 30s and early 40s of artists, critics, curators.
And Sobel fit into that because, for those of you who don't know, she was a quote-unquote self-taught artist. She had not gone to art school. She had not received any formal training. She began to make art around 1940 when she was around or almost 50 years old. And so that biographical story that, as you were saying, Sandra, this idea of the self-taught artist being unimpeachably original was a really much discussed facet of her rise in those early years in the press, that she was part of this group of self-taught artists.
Because Sidney Janis also had a role at MoMA, the idea of self-taught art was also institutionalized there. And something that we didn't talk about, but we should maybe, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, one of the founders of MoMA, also had a kind of folk art collection. So there was this institutionalization early on in kind of crafting modern art for the United States audience that was always kind of imbricated the idea of the self-taught as a part of that.
However, it did
narrative.
hit a very big stumbling block in 1943 when Hirschfeld had his show there that Sidney Janis had insisted upon having, and Alfred Barr ultimately lost his job for hosting the exhibition. But that's a whole other story.
Interest up to a point. Yeah. And here, maybe you want to mention, Susan, just that Peggy was also a collector of Hirschfeld's work as well.
Yes, she was. She owned this painting, and this is in the basement of that Beekman Place townhouse. You may notice behind the three gentlemen overlooking the nude at the window, the Ernst Surrealism and Painting, which Peggy then owned. Lenore Carrington is seated in front of the painting, and then there's a mannequin, which is a pretty traditional surrealist trope, wearing a cape, which some people have thought perhaps is Peggy Guggenheim. I'm not sure I would really agree with that. But Peggy owned this work early on, and then she ultimately traded it back to Janis and bought another painting from the 43 show, where in those days you could buy art directly out of museum exhibitions.
And I think I love this photograph. I mean, as many of you surely realize, and as Susan said, Surrealism and Painting, which is hanging just down the hall, and the Surrealism galleries is behind them. But just to make the point that these categories of self-taught, which might seem today quite distinct from Surrealism as represented by Max Ernst, which might seem quite different from the new style of abstraction that was to emerge just a few years later with the abstract expressionists. Like, this is all in this swirling pot together.
Very much so. And I think artists are purposely kind of drawing inspiration from each other as they, new things emerge.
Yeah, it's like our categorizations have come, in some cases, much later. So then, another major group exhibition that Sobel participates in is abstract and surrealist art in the United States. This is a big traveling show. I've put at the bottom of the slide that it went to Cincinnati, Denver, Seattle, Santa Barbara, Portland, and San Francisco. And just by way of saying that, again, Sobel's art is part of this group of traveling modernist pictures that are circulating around the United States at this point. And in that moment, she is shown alongside some of these works by Pollock, Rothko, and Max Ernst, which is also in our collection today. But just how this is already a different recoding or a different sort of group of peers that she's being placed in conversation with.
These are all on the surrealist side in terms of Janus's kind of dichotomy that he's trying to sketch out. Like he places Pollock as a surrealist, Sobel as a surrealist, Rothko as a surrealist, which I think you've done a really good job of showing in the surrealist galleries.
Yeah, those early years before they get sort of, put into the ABEX
and
camp.
Also, as what happens with a lot of these artists, obviously not Max Ernst, but on the American side, is that they move from this kind of surrealist imagery into all-over abstraction.
And Greenberg hated this show. He panned it and said, this was just, anyways. I don't remember. He colorfully panned it, but later said, well, it was one of the first exhibitions that showed, European and American artists together,
which is really what New York art scene was at that time in the 40s. We should say that Janus also organized this exhibition,
yes,
so
yeah,
he's continuing to play a very significant role up until 48 when he opens his own gallery and really switches to abstract expressionism, and then ultimately pop art in the 60s.
One detail that I just wanted to mention before we leave this exhibition from 44 is that Sobel exhibits a painting called Devotion of the Spirits, which was a painting on glass. It was destroyed when it was being shipped between one location and another. I've put in disappointment just as a kind of stand-in for the more style of work that it would have been, something more figurative. And then Sobel, or actually Janus, sends a replacement painting, which is quite different. He sends the painting Music. This work is now lost. It's been lost for many years. But this already gestures at the type of abstraction that Sobel was very much in the process in late 1944 of developing. So we know that this painting is possibly seen in, I think, the Portland iteration of abstract and surrealist art, and is definitely seen in San Francisco. But just that kind of extraordinary switch in how she's represented in the show. So, just to quickly move through time a bit, in April of 1944, in fact, 80 years ago exactly today, Sobel's first solo show opens in New York at Puma Gallery. It's a exhibition of around 20 paintings, some of which are exhibited down the hall. And it's after this show that that Peggy Guggenheim really seems to notice Sobel. So there's this great letter that Peggy writes to a kind of fellow gallerist, in which at the bottom you can see she has written, "Put Janet Sobel on your women's list." They were in the process of elaborating an exhibition of all-female artists, and Peggy continues, "She is the best woman painter by far, parentheses, in America." So from this moment on, she really, in a way, I think, supplants Janus as the sort of real mover of Sobel's work, putting her in group exhibitions, giving her another solo show, and also sending her pictures around to other places. So there's this group exhibition at Art of this Century Gallery that we've been talking about that opens in the very first days of 1946 that amounts to one of the first moments where Sobel's all over abstract pictures like Milky Way and the attraction of pink are displayed. Although, as we were discussing yesterday, it's almost a kind of small, tiny, retrospective of 3 years of work. This is not the only kind of work that Sobel shows there.
I think there were only about 6 or 7 of the all-over abstractions, and most of the other work was that more figurative, self-taught kind of imagery. But the exhibition did well. I mean, it garnered a number of reviews and captured a lot of the imagination of people in New York. About 5 or 6 things sold from the exhibition, Peggy buying the Frightening Bride, which is here on view.
No,
it's not, sorry.
But we'll see it later.
Oh, okay. And Sheldon Rodman, who was art historian, purchased something, and Rudy Blesch, who worked a lot with Harriet Janis, Sidney's wife. He was a jazz musician. They each bought a drawing. So, and the prices, what for me was always interesting in looking through Peggy's account books, is that the prices were exactly the same as what Pollock was selling for. So there was no discrepancy in that regard. Because this was really, after the Puma show, and it's hard to know how many people really saw that show, this was probably the most exciting gallery to be in at the time.
And we know, and Sandra, maybe you can talk a bit about this since you've written extensively on it, that this is a show that Pollock sees, and has this kind of legacy, although a belated legacy, as one of the first presentations of this all-over effect.
Right. So much later, in 1958, Greenberg, it was first published in 55, Greenberg revises it in 58 and then republishes this essay in 61. He talks about seeing Janet Sobel with Pollock at Peggy Guggenheim's, and again calls her a primitive painter, Janet Sobel, who was and still is a housewife living in Brooklyn, and Pollock.
Which she was not at that point, still living in Brooklyn either.
Right, she'd moved to New Jersey.
Yeah. Worse, I would say.
And then he goes on, Pollock and I myself admired these pictures rather furtively. They showed schematic little drawings of faces almost lost in a dense tracery of thin black lines lying over and under a mottled field of predominantly warm and translucent color. The effect, and it was the first really all-over one that I had ever seen since Toby's show came months later, was strangely pleasing. And later on, Pollock admitted that these pictures had made an impression on him. So this is a really big revision to Greenberg's definitive essay on the New York School, where he inserts Janet Sobel into the narrative. So she's not in the original version of this essay that was published in 1955, but he kind of almost plucks her out of obscurity, because she was already off the radar in 55, she's off the radar in 58. And kind of gives her pride of place, but at the same time calls her a primitive and a housewife. And also, I guess, like living far away off the grid in Brooklyn.
And it's so interesting how, as you said, he brings her up, but really contains her very much. It's like, she's allowed to have this cameo in the essay about Pollock and about the New York School, but only up to a point. She's contained by being a primitive painter, so not really a threat to the artist that he's more interested in at that point, right?
Yeah, and I want to argue also that it was safer for Pollock, for Greenberg to allow Pollock to have been influenced by a woman and by a self-taught artist than it would have been for Pollock to be influenced by Toby, because Toby was not a self-taught artist. He was a fellow abstract expressionist who was having a great deal of fame in 1958 when Greenberg rewrote this paragraph. He had won first prize at the Venice Biennale, and people were really starting to know who Mark Toby was, and Greenberg kind of puts him aside and anoints Sobel.
It's interesting to me, too, that this is 58, because Pollock dies in 56, so it's a little bit of his own homage to Pollock, who he really brought forward critically. And
Yeah, he was very
supported
close with
from the
him.
very, very beginning.
Yeah. So I'm not sure we know what the full record was. I don't know if,
Or why he did it, unless it was is it a slight to Toby? Is it a way to bring Sobel forward? Is it
both?
or is it, it's an interesting.
It's a really peculiar move, I think, rhetorically, what he's doing. And, we can maybe talk about it in the question portion of this evening, because I think it's quite fascinating what the motivation is for Greenberg to kind of resurrect Sobel, who he, by the way, never wrote about. When she had all of these solo shows in the mid-40s, he did not write about her.
As we've alluded to, Sobel, by 1955, by 1958, is no longer living in New York, not even in Brooklyn. She had moved with her family to New Jersey around 1947, which is a really, many events kind of align in 1947 with that move. The first is that Peggy Guggenheim also leaves New York and moves to Venice, Italy. Around that time, too, Sobel develops apparently an allergy to something in the paints that she's been using. And so as a result of that, her painting production seems to slow, and she begins to work more with create more works on paper, crayon drawings, that sort of thing, which you can see in the exhibition. The result of all of these things is that the exhibition that she had at Peggy Guggenheim's at the Art of This Century in 1946 is her last big showing in New York. But one thing that we were talking about is that despite that, Guggenheim's advocacy does continue for a little while. And the first that I wanted to mention is, again, this painting Music that had been sent to California, is sent by Guggenheim to the University of Iowa in the summer of 1946 for a kind of summer contemporary art exhibition at the university. And this is right around the same time that Guggenheim gifts Jackson Pollock's mural to the University of Iowa. That happens just 2 years later. Do you want to talk about Iowa?
I don't know why she went to Iowa. I've never been able to figure that out, because she had no relations there at all. But when Peggy closed the gallery in '47 and then moves to Venice, she actually doesn't. She does bring the collection, most of the collection right away, but a lot of it goes into storage. This particular work was commissioned by Peggy for the entrance hallway of her East 61st Street townhouse that she'd moved to after she and Ernst divorced. And this is a great moment in Pollock's work. He really transitions from that more surrealist figuration into an all-over abstraction, and yet you can still read a lot of figures as you move across the canvas. It barely fit into the hallway. There's a lot of stories that it got cut off by Duchamp. That is absolutely not true. The painting spent several years recently at the Getty being conserved, so they've been able to definitively prove that that did not happen. It's one of those wonderful stories that travels with a lot of artwork. But I have no sense of why she went to Iowa. But this is the only work she gave to Iowa, and she did give, starting in the 50s, she gave 11 Pollocks away from Tel Aviv to San Francisco, to the Stedelijk Museum, et cetera, and a number of other works from her collection that had been shown at Art of This Century. Because once she opened the palazzo that we now go to visit today in 1951, she then started to focus on Italian artists.
Before she opens that, the palazzo, right, there's this exhibition, this display of her collection at the Venice Biennale in 1948. And
in the Greek pavilion.
Yes, in the Greek pavilion. And is a display of, again, this kind of, surrealist art, some self-taught, as we see here, abstraction. but Sobel is among those artists. So in that little yellow box there, you see the very top of the painting, The Frightened Bride, which looks like this, and which was shown, again, right alongside another Morris Hirschfeld, which is the one that she had exchanged the earlier one we saw for, two women in front of a mirror. So, I mean, I love the revelation that Sobel is shown in Venice in 1948, and in such, again, great company, but also, again, recontextualized in this way alongside Hirschfeld with work that is much more leaning into her abstract phase.
Mm-hmm. I guess they were shown together also because the color scheme goes together now that I'm looking at them side by side.
There's a huge, well, no, the scale is actually quite different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think another issue with Sobel's reception was that she could never break free from that self-taught category. And Greenberg in particular characterized self-taught artists as never being able to rid themselves of abstraction. Obviously, Sobel did that, but she also returned to abstraction, as many artists have, returned to figuration, as many artists have. Mm-hmm. And there's many works that kind of hover between abstraction and figuration, where it's mainly abstract, but with all of these faces emerging. As I just was looking at Mural, I see Pollock doing very similar things.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to hide it.
Yeah.
The Venice Biennale here was also the European debut of Pollock, and notably Alchemy from 1947 is shown, a work that's still in the Peggy Guggenheim collection. And then we have our kind of coda to the story, which is that in much later, again, about 20 years after the Venice Biennale presentation, two of Sobel's paintings find their way into the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection.
Yeah, so William Rubin, who was hired by MoMA to do a temporary exhibition called Dada, Surrealism, and Their Heritage, starts investigating Sobel. He wants to follow up on what Greenberg had written. And so he writes to Peggy to try to locate Sobel, because he's making an exhibition that's going to start with Dada, Surrealism, and then transition into abstract expressionism and pop art. And so he is the first to really follow up in a tangible way about, like, well, who is Sobel? What do the works look like? And so he manages in 1968 to visit the family, and he selects these two paintings. The first, Milky Way, which I think is one of her strongest paintings, for donation to MoMA's collection. He originally wanted to put it in the exhibition, Dada, Surrealism, and Their Heritage, but he located Sobel too late to do that. And then he selects this other, smaller work for his own collection. And I'm still wondering if he paid for it or if he just took it.
This was in the days when curators could do that.
Yes.
So he perhaps paid for or was gifted the little painting, and then with the understanding that it be gifted to the museum upon his death. So in the 80s, it joined its friend.
He hadn't died in the 80s.
Oh,
so he died in 2006. So
but he decides to
start
distributing things.
His consciousness got hold of him.
Yeah, so these are the two paintings that Rubin selects to try to prove this kind of lineage, which I hope one of the things we can also discuss is sort of like how to get Sobel out of Pollock's shadow. And, I hope we're trying to do that by pointing to other points of influence in a larger context. Of course, World War II is another major context for her work. But that's not, what Rubin wants to do is slot her in right next to Pollock.
In one of these very, kind of incredible stories, the works are approved for acquisition by the Museum of Modern Art in 1968 in November, just a couple of days essentially after Sobel's death. This is a letter that her son Saul, who was one of her major champions, who brought her work to the attention of many of the people we've been discussing, like Max Ernst and Peggy Guggenheim and Sidney Janis and others. So this is the letter that Saul writes to the Museum of Modern Art, saying that, you know, he's received the news that Milky Way and the smaller work have been accessioned, but that the news came too late for Sobel to sort of rejoice in this very end of life kind of triumph. And then just by way of closing, I wanted for us to end with this little installation of Sobel's work with some friends at the LA County Museum of Art at LACMA. So the painting in the center, which is the burning bush, is of course on view here down the hall, but this is how it was installed when I saw it a couple years ago, when I started to go travel around and look at some of her paintings in real life. The eagle-eyed among you will note that we reframed the painting for the show. So here, again, it's sort of hard to see here, but it's essentially located in the center of and in dialogue with Jackson Pollock and Mark Tobey, who we were talking about a little while ago. And so when I saw this wall, this hang, I loved the argument that it was making and how she was being resituated among these sort of modernist friends. And maybe that's something that we can just end with, talking about her, sort of seeing her in this broader context, but also the many other contextual sort of environments in which she could fit. We also saw The Frightened Bride, which is a painting stylistically quite similar to The Burning Bush, be hung alongside a Morris Hirschfeld. So sort of what other artists to contextualize her with.
Yeah, I think part of the interesting problem that she poses is that she could be part of the context of the early New York school, a burgeoning abstract expressionism. She could be part of the context of surrealism. And she also, of course, was a self-taught artist. And so it wasn't that she didn't fit into categories, but that she fit into too many categories, I think. And so that made her work perhaps a little bit difficult to digest or to kind of characterize in that neat and easy way. But I think that's also one of the really exciting things about her work, is how hybrid it is, and how she's working kind of between all of these modes that haven't yet concretized. Like, everything is so fluid at this moment in the 40s, and she's really able to capitalize on that for the brief moment that those things were, all potential avenues for her, and then it kind of gets shut down in 47, as you mentioned, with Peggy's departure for Venice, and her departure for New Jersey.
Why do we think that she actually went so abstract? You get a sense of it in the early figurative works, because there's a lot of patterning, which you definitely see in the abstract works, but the fact that she really, uninitiated, just goes for it.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
I think that there's a way, in seeing some of her earlier works, that there's a way to see the abstraction as almost continuing the logic or the premise that she sets out in even very early works that are highly figurative, but they are so figurative as to be almost decorative, in the sense that the figures kind of form a kind of flat background, and they're interwoven with the trees and the landscape and the foliage, and there isn't a real sense of recessive depth. And to my mind, it's, having seen a number of them, it doesn't seem so very far away to think of just continuing and sort of amping up that kind of interblending and going from interblending to all over and just leaving the figure behind. But one thing that is so interesting about her work, I think, is that, and again, as you said, Sandra, that's not either necessarily unusual, is that she goes into all over abstraction, but then also will come back and reincorporate figures in later works as well. So it's not a complete, total, wholesale abandoning of the figure. In Burning Bush, which is one of these really key transitional paintings that predates Milky Way, you see, I think, most clearly these two figures. Do I have a pointer here? No, I'm not sure. But you see these two figures in white on the screen, and there's a kind of continuing like vacuuming out of that kind of residual trace of figuration that goes on, and then it comes back.
Yeah, I see it as kind of like emerging and resting on the surface, and kind of, you know, she doesn't want to commit to any one kind of mode of art making, and she doesn't need to, right? The rules haven't been set, which is a great thing.
I mean, one thing that you were saying, Sandra, about I think, you know, back in the days when the sort of histories of these art movements are being written for the first time, there is this difficulty with the stylistic diversity, perhaps, that she presented in this very short span of years. But I think, as you were alluding to, now that's seen as a kind of perk or a plus, or we really like that sort of multiplicity. It reminds me, this is, you know, a totally different moment, but it reminds me a little bit of Merritt Oppenheim, which some of you may have seen that exhibition a couple years ago here, who had a much longer career, many decades, but in a similar way, her stylistic diversity was taken way back in the 50s and 60s in Switzerland and in Europe as a mark of her being, you know, kind of flighty and not very serious. And now there's this moment, there was a turning, right? There was a moment of turning where that stylistic diversity and refusal to sign up for any one kind of movement or camp or school is seen as something, you know, very liberatory and really great.
Yeah, a strength, I would even say.
Yeah.
So Sobel was doing that, obviously, perhaps without realizing it, and she paid the price too, because the 40s wasn't a time. I mean, there were, just like Hirschfeld also maybe paid a particular.
Hirschfeld dies, though.
Ooh, the ultimate price.
I mean, he dies in 46. And Peggy actually gives him the memorial show in 47.
Which was bold, you know, when I think about it, because he had been so panned in 43.
Yes, but again, I think a lot of her constituents, the gentlemen around her, Duchamp, Ernst, Breton, etc., really pushed all of that on her. And she listened to her advisors, very much so.
Yeah.
I have to say, it's interesting to me because when Sobel shows at Art of this Century, Pollock has already had 3 shows there. And it's his last show that really shows his own movement toward abstraction. And yet, right before his death, he brings back the figure in paintings like Portrait in a Dream and such.
Yeah.
And for me, they're very different kinds of artists, even though they constantly get talked about in the same vein. And I think that seeing the exhibition here has really convinced me how radically different they are.
I'm just so fascinated to imagine what might have transpired had Peggy Guggenheim not left New York in 1947, and whether her advocacy of Sobel would have continued even from New Jersey, or, I mean, it's sort of an impossible question, but it's not that, she was not living much further either than where she was in Brooklyn.
Yes,
so
true.
It's a sort of like sense of being very far, but in reality not that far. But it's just one of these like alternate routes, what would have happened if type thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question that we can sort of end on, is like, what are the stakes of thinking about Sobel's role in this moment in New York, and how we think about American painting or abstract expressionism or modern art as a whole. I didn't pose that as a question, but
It seems
it's a question.
as if you did.
Yeah, maybe at this point we could open it up for any questions or, yes. Oh, and I think Tony has a microphone that will be coming around.
So, as I describe myself, I'm just an art groupie, not a collector, but a lot of my friends are creatives. Did she leave any archive of letters, diaries, journals, or, I mean, everything is quoted about her from somebody else's description of her, even her son's letter which is heartbreaking to read. But did she leave anything in her own hand where she wrote letters to people or anything?
There are some letters that we have between her and Sidney Janis, for instance, her and Peggy Guggenheim. There's also what we have sort of Janet Sobel in her own words. There were, as Susan mentioned, a number of profiles and stories about her that were published in the New York press around 1944-45, several of which quoted her. And she also gives a radio interview in, I think, 1945, so we have at least a transcript of that. So there are bits and pieces, but she was not, as far as I have found so far, she was not, to my knowledge, an artist who had, left behind a tremendous body of writing about her work. There aren't, that I've found, journals, right? I mean, like, the great thing that one would love to find is her talking about having gone to see other artists' exhibitions, or, what historical art was she looking at, and that we really don't have a kind of historical record. We just can guess.
I think we should also say that she had a very full family life. She had 5 children and a number of grandchildren, and she was obviously very busy with her own art. So I think she was quite focused on all of that, as well as helping her husband in the family business, which was a jewelry business, and taking care of an expansive family, which is not unusual for a lot of women. Well, but she wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
But she really stepped out at the end of the day.
Thank you all so much for this really wonderful conversation. I'm wondering if we can go back to that opening image of her working that opened the talk.
On the floor.
Yes.
So I've always
Back and
wondered
back.
where that, if that's a staged photograph or
Yes,
not.
I think
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
So this is so amazing to think about, especially in relation to the staged photographs of Pollock working. And so I have 2 questions about this. One is, can you kind of speak to the setting in which she's making her work? It looks like a home space, but I don't know if I'm misinterpreting that. And if you could talk about what it means for her as a painter at this moment to be working in the space of the home. And then relatedly, if you can talk about, like, what is her working process? And I mean, I know we can't literally see what her working process is in this photograph, but how does it compare to this, like, thrashing gesture that we associate with all over painting from these Pollock photographs?
Yeah, maybe I could just start in contrast to the Pollock photograph. I particularly dislike this photograph of her because I think it infantilizes her. It's kind of the way, like, a child lies in their bedroom and she's almost at leisure, and it doesn't take the painting seriously. And I think that's especially evident when you think about Pollock's, like, decisive action in the arena of the canvas. And like the way she's holding the brush kind of bothers me. What she's wearing stockings, high heels, and so I'm almost positive that it's a staged photograph. And I wonder if a photographer kind of said, "Oh, what if you did this? What if you did that?" And she was like, "Okay."
Although one thing that I totally agree with you, Sandra, but I would just add that the sort of incredible performed leisure of her pose is also totally belied by the productivity that surrounds her with these, like, stacks of canvases that are, like, one on top of the other in the background. So totally agree with you about the sort of semiotics of the image, but it also shows truly how much work she produced at the same time.
Right.
And yes, Michelle, you had asked about the space of the home, and in this moment, before the move to the much mythologized move to New Jersey, she is living in an apartment on Brighton Beach, like quite close to the water, or close to the beach at least. And there are some interviews or remarks that have, make their way into profiles of her at the time, where she talks about loving to walk along the water and picking up seashells and making little paintings on those and that sort of thing. To her process, we were having a discussion about that yesterday. And I think she was incredibly adventurous with her choice of materials, both what she used to make marks and what she made the marks on. I think one thing that this image gets right, perhaps, is that she worked on the horizontal and making those drip paintings. And we were talking about it with regard to one of the works in the show, where it seems she would work on the horizontal and then physically lift up the stretched canvas and tip it, so manipulate it in that way. So not only dancing around, not exactly dancing around the canvas the way that Pollock did, but doing this more kind of holding the picture in her hands and tipping it and manipulating it that way.
I would actually also add that it's not unusual for artists to work so domestically like this. Hirschfeld worked in his bedroom. Magritte worked every day in a suit in his bedroom. Space was not, people didn't have large artist studios the way that they do today. So it doesn't surprise me that even if this is a staged photograph.
But the domestic setting is accurate.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Natalie?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add, because I'm an alum of the University of Iowa, and the mural is one of the crown jewels of our collection, that Peggy Guggenheim was leaving to Venice. She had offered the painting to Yale, and they rejected it.
Yeah.
And so she had a relationship with the University of Iowa art department, the head of the department, and said, if you can pay to get it to Iowa, you can have it.
That's
and
right.
And they did. It's huge. It's enormous. So it probably cost a fortune to ship it, but they wanted it, and it's amazing. So yeah, we're very proud of it.
Will you also look for music?
Yeah.
We think it's in the storeroom.
We think it might be there. Natalie thinks it's there.
I had a follow-up question about the image on the screen. Do we know that she's holding a paintbrush? Because, getting back to the question of process, one of the things that would be interesting for you all to talk about is that she uses pipettes and how that relates to the family business. Could she be actually holding a pipette in this photo?
It's possible.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah. The family business, Susan, I think, alluded to this, but the family business was that they made costume jewelry and were especially renowned for their artificial pearls. And so there's been this thought that some of the materials that she used in her paints might have come from the business. And so that the enamel that appears on a lot of the labels, it might have been enamel from that. And that would go some distance to sort of explaining or giving more context for the pearlescent kind of dimension to some of the paints that she uses. And yes, as Natalie was mentioning, there have been, there's also been stories, and it was reported on at the time, that she used pipettes in blowing through glass pipettes to move the wet paint around the canvas. And something we were talking about yesterday and sort of puzzling over is another story that she used a vacuum cleaner to sort of suck the painting around, or was it possibly a more industrial kind of vacuum cleaner, not a domestic one that could be reversed so that it could actually be an instrument for blowing the paint around? But I don't know
Maybe
that we can say for certain.
That would be easier.
Yeah.
I don't think they had blow dryers then. You wore something on your hat, and you were attached to a tube, and you sat in a chair. It was kind of complicated.
Yes.
So I'm really, really impressed for this collection, because I came here a few days ago and I saw this collection of Sobel, and I said, I know this woman, where I know his name. And it was in Paris, it was in just for Peggy, and it was a collection of paintings, but she was in the group of American artists. And I said, I was with my sister, she's a painter in France, and she said, but in fact, she's not American, she's European. And because she was with Max Ernst and all these people, of course she knew all the tendencies in Europe. And she was sewing and looking that so for long years But she has so many, she absorbed so much art as Frida Kahlo. Same, but they are considered hardwired. They have not a tradition in art, they have not a school of art, but I agree for me they are great because they could express themselves with their own means, okay? One being very handicraft, as we know, and this one, not handicraft, but was busy with a lot of children. But even though it happened, she was a handicraft.
Thank you. And yes, there was a show at the Pompidou a couple of years ago of women abstract artists that had a couple, I think, great Janet Sobels in it. So it's, which we love to see, which is great.
So I'm an art dealer who showed Janet Sobel's work and gave her a show in 2002, which was her first solo show since the Peggy Guggenheim 1946 show. But the favorite show that I did was called Paintings from a Photograph, and I did an exhibition where I tried to find as many of these pictures as possible. So just a couple things. I was told by the family, and I don't know if it was true, that this photograph was done by a pretty famous photographer. I think his name was Ben Schnall, and it was actually made because there was going to be an article on her in Life magazine.
Oh, yeah.
And it's really extraordinary because there wasn't. But if you think about Pollock, right, wasn't there the Jack the Dripper, wasn't that the famous
As 48.
46 or something? So it makes you wonder what would have happened if this had been. And then just a couple things from some of the questions. And it's interesting, one of the great things about this show is that you can make these connections, but on the very top, you'll see Burning Bush,
Yes.
which is the very top painting in the center. Burning, that's Los Angeles County Museum of Art's painting. Something that I only found out later, that the painting that she's doing on the floor is The Frightened Bride, and it's in process. And then the painting that's also in the show, Disappointment, this was one of my favorite finds. But if you look at the column to the left going vertical, there's like a stack of paintings. And on the third painting back, you can see this little face on the bottom left-hand corner. That's Disappointment. So, you can have some fun with the show. And the last thing was the question about they don't look like some of the other paintings. I think this is 1944, and Burning Bush is probably the most all-over painting. I think these other paintings might have done in 45, 46, 47, so we don't see that full, expression yet in this kind of wild painting.
Hi. Sorry. Just regarding this question of the vacuum cleaner, I found some very, very obscure footage in the deep corners of the internet that I had to download a strange program to access, with a conversation with Sobel, one of the sons, discussing this process. And he said she took her vacuum cleaner and he physically gestured to manipulate the paint on the canvas, and it looked like it was a sort of under 5 minutes or so preview for an unmade documentary on her work. And the journalist or art historian, I'm not sure, was visiting the home and sort of going through her works on paper. No idea what happened to that project. And yeah, it's not on YouTube or anything, but so that story's out there, and then it was clarified by the granddaughter last year in an interview for James Barron joint show that the granddaughter did with Sobel's work called Spiritual Connection at James Barron Art. So if there's any way of someone using their sort of resources to find some of that footage and have it exist out there, I think that'd be really interesting, because especially with regarding this being in the living room, the vacuum cleaner and her position as housewife, all of that is really fascinating and charming, yeah.
Thank you, Sarah and Gary. If there are no more questions, perhaps this is a time for us to wrap up, and thank you so much for coming tonight. Thank you.